my podcast has been on pause for 2 years plus, and the previous incarnation of my podcast, as you know, Raymond, because you were on it a couple times, at least two
Hmm.
times, um, was the Infinite Weird, and it is now being called the Lucid Institute podcast, at least for now. So thanks, Raymond, again for joining me for this new chapter of the podcast as my
Thanks for
first
having me,
guest.
Matthew. Yeah, yeah, of course. I've always respected the work of the Lucid Institute and its founder. Although, who's to say if that founder entity was even its founder, and maybe it's just always been
Exactly.
around.
Yeah.
Um,
Good old Bartholomew Sterling. He's a mysterious creature. Um,
Indeed.
I yeah, I'm happy to have you on here. Raymond is a philosopher and a musician and a great friend of mine here in Los Angeles, and we have all sorts of great conversations all the time. And I often look back at those and think, damn, I wish that that was recorded. And
Yeah.
so this is fun to kind of consecrate our dialogue here.
Yes,
Um,
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in the first, as we've talked about in in the Infinite Weird days, it was more focused on the individual being interviewed and kind of their backstory and their relationship with spirituality and things like that and creativity.
Yeah.
In this new kind of chapter, I want to do a little bit of that, but I want to kind of shift it to focusing on a specific theme or set of themes that I can have a dialogue with somebody about. And the topic that I wanted to talk about today is truth, beauty, and goodness. These kind of classic three pillars in philosophy that seem
Hmm.
kind of like inevitable themes for philosophers to explore, I would say. And th- these are themes that you and I have discussed many times.
Yes.
But I think that you're a kind of a great person to talk about these specific topics with. So
Thank you.
let's dive in.
Sure.
And the first thing I want to ask you is, do you remember when you consciously started being interested in topics like truth, beauty, and goodness?
Hmm. Consciously is a kind of an operating word there.
Yeah.
Um, I remember being interested in learning about the world just for as long as I can remember, and pretty shortly after that having a strong creative impulse. So I suppose in that regard there was sort of a drive towards truth and beauty, maybe. And I think a more kind of conscious sense of being driven towards the good. Um, I would say that would be like sort of early childhood when um almost as sort of like a drive towards like sort of harmonization or like redemption in the sense of like something's wrong here. Like something's wrong in the world. Um or there's some sort of like suffering going on and just kind of like not either not wanting to be the kind of person that would cause that sort of thing and sort of like acquiring virtue in reverse almost or else trying to figure out you know how one could approach a better version of what was going on,
Mhm.
which tied into like kind of my early relationship with spirituality. So yeah, there's a sort of a sense of like curiosity about the world. So there's this maybe like an implicit assumption of like there's something true out there to learn about, and being and kind of like chasing after that, and then um, creativity being wanted to just like kind of make things that I liked. So there's the beauty aspect, and then the good being sort of like what to do, what not to do, with regards to just like kind of a sense of um, something kind of yeah, like a reaction to ugliness, which already we're kind of
Hmm.
linking beauty and goodness. So yeah, does that
Yeah.
answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, totally. So, some of your early pull toward spirituality and religion, would you say all three of those things were kind of operating together, or do you think that your, you know, eventual or starting to value the good, do you think that's the main thing that brought you to religion when you were younger?
Um, well, I should bracket this by saying that, religion was something that was in the mix, just, from who my parents were, and then, the school that I went
Mm-hmm.
to, that sort of thing. Um, so it was already kind of like part of the soil that I grew those concepts from for myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of it was like a kind of like an untangling from that. And then yeah, I do think that kind of the desire to have a container and have a story essentially, to kind of like to thread together all of my notions of what the truth was, and all of my notions of what the good was, or the beautiful. Yeah, that part of the reason why I was drawn to a religious way of thinking, um was just, wanting a good story to contain all that, and especially a story that for a while anyway, centered around um an acknowledgement of sort of abject suffering, and then a desire to um have that be redeemed, cleansed, purified, rectified, to kind of make things right. Um, and also kind of attend to the sense of like awe, and these, if not transcendent, then certainly just uh, a sense of like the numinous or the beyond, something that could contain that as well, and the way that kind of permeates
Mm-hmm.
through all of nature in my experience. Yeah.
Yeah. Were, you said early on, like certain types of suffering kind of motivated you to, or revealed to you that something was wrong and something needed to be changed or addressed. And what were the first kinds of suffering, if if you're comfortable
Hmm.
going into this, first types of suffering that kind of made you feel that way? And do you feel like the same kinds of suffering that you were concerned about early on, or this are the same that you're still concerned about?
Yeah. So, I mean, without getting into too much detail, a lot of it had to do with just my experience at home. That there were certain ways of going about the world or being in the world that just, directly led to other people experiencing pain, physical pain, emotional pain, um, and kind of like an experience of how pain and suffering radiates. Like it's not just it's not just sort of like, it behaves like it's a physical reaction. Like it's not just like, a mathematical point mass hitting another point mass, and there you have like an exchange of momentum. It's like, no, those things happen, and then it'll sort of like kind of create these like ripple effects and chain reactions. And so, um, having a kind of a very acute understanding of how suffering worked in that way, um, I think motivated me to try to just figure out, how to navigate that, how to ameliorate that sort of thing. And I do think that ties into, I think the second part of your question was something to the idea of like that, those experiences, suffering, if they relate to the kinds of changes I motivated to affect in the present day. Yeah, yeah. Because I think it's just, um, ultimately it is something, um, that is so deeply and fundamentally human. like with regards to just our ignorance and our greed and frailty. Um, and just that rears its head in every facet of just our day-to-day experience as people.
Hmm.
If we're like thinking about truth, beauty, and goodness as universals or transcendentals, really, like I mean, you could flip that on its head and sort of think about like falsehood, ugliness, and suffering as just a sort of like universal
Hmm.
and like negative transcendentals.
Hmm.
And like what do we do with that? If that
Yeah.
if that makes sense. I know I
Yeah,
kind of like
totally.
kind of opened it up a little bit at the end, but yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And would you say that, the kind of the awe that you mentioned, or even transcendence, and creativity, do you think that those have always felt like kind of agents of healing or something like that in the face of suffering?
Mm, I'll stick with awe because I think as we talked about,
Yeah,
and actually we talked about maybe on the first time I was on this podcast, sort of a bit of a um, there's a bit of slipperiness when it comes to the concept of transcendence,
of course.
but with awe, yes, I think what it does or what it can do is and I use this I use this word, I think, when I was talking about like just religion and myth and story. Like it offers a container. I think there is something about suffering that, for good reason. I mean, a part of it's probably just like a survival thing, but it really roots you in the immediacy of your experience. Um, and if you, and that's like kind of like the danger of it, is that if you are either so mired in suffering that you can't afford to think of anything else, which is real, or if you are so kind of taken by the despair of your suffering that you can't see anything else. Um, this kind of it does sort of like shrink your world. And so what I think what awe can do is sort of like recontextualize essentially your experience in something that is so far beyond yourself in a way, or maybe even like within yourself, you want to go like the microscopic direction that it decenters um the sense of like all I can think about and all I am is my suffering, and that's just gonna be how it's gonna be for like the rest of eternity. It's like, well, no, it's not. It'll pass. In one way or another. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel like movies and music and stuff like that when you were a kid kind of operated that way for you?
Yes. So sometimes, yeah, as well, certainly as vehicles for like a shift in perspective or like a shift in feeling, which ties aesthetics or like art with uh, or sort of like attends to the ways in which like aesthetics can be used as a vehicle for alleviating suffering, right?
Mm.
Uh,
And transforming it too.
Transforming it, yeah, and also they're vehicles for truth because they again it's like if it's a shift in perspective, then you're kind of like just looking at things in a different way,
Hmm.
seeing things that you might not have been able to be aware of because of your experience,
Hmm.
your circumstance.
Hmm.
Sure. Yeah. I think that was definitely part of why I gravitated towards art in general, music in particular. It was in part because of that transportational quality that I could be in my room with my headphones on and whatever was going on around me, I had my inner world that I could make beautiful
Yeah.
or invite different perspectives, different like sort of have reminders of things.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and there's such a link um, between music in particular um, and a sense of like the religious it because it I think there's something about like the acoustic quality of it. It fills a space. It's like a fragrance, I was listening to like a lot of medieval music today for whatever reason, One of the things that I kind of remembered slash noticed was that, especially with like plain chant and things like that, where it's just one monophonic line, was how much the quality of the overall experience of the music depended upon like reverb. I could kind of sense like the way in which that would inspire like a sacramental quality, because it's like it's like a lingering kind of, you've changed the feeling of how it is to be in that space through sound. Anyway, not to get too sort of too far afield, but yeah, I think that, art communicates a world. And when you're in, especially when you feel helpless, um, in a space, that through technology and through art, you can kind of change at least your inner world if you can't change your outer world, which is powerful.
True, 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 true. Yeah, yeah. Um, some of what you said kind of reminded me of something I've been thinking about recently. Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion in Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and a big figure in Zen and stuff. And she is like the hearer of the suffering of the world.
Mm,
And she has multiple eyes and multiple arms, to indicate that
interesting.
she's seeing everything and kind of being able to touch things that need to be, addressed and everything. And in the Shurangama Sutra, I'm not going to get too deep into this, but I just wanted to
It's fine.
mention in the Shurangama Sutra, the Buddha asks all these bodhisattvas, like basically, what has been your vehicle for awakening, or something like that.
Hmm.
And Avalokiteshvara says that for her, it's been the practice of listening, the practice of hearing, and there's this really interesting connection between listening and compassion. And for her, as kind of this figure or archetype, it's the practice is that somehow the act of listening naturally leads, or can naturally lead, to a certain kind of compassion.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so I just wanted to throw that in there.
Yeah, and just to kind
But
of oh,
yeah,
sorry.
yeah, please, please.
Well, yeah, just to kind of bounce on that, and maybe this is also sort of assessed with whatever segue you were going to pull
Mm-hmm.
there.
Mm-hmm.
But when you were talking about like having many limbs, many eyes, I just thought um, of like the notion of aesthetics and like aesthesis is feeling, right? So
Yeah,
and then compassion, compathos, it's to suffer with. And so there's a direct link there between the more aware you are, the more you kind of are feeling into the world, the more you're touching it, um,
yeah,
the more you are, it's compassionate almost by definition, because you are opening yourself up to a greater degree of feeling and of awareness and experience than you would otherwise. And that is, I mean, not to immediately get all like Judeo-Christian about it, but that is kind of like, it is kind of an image of like the Christ archetype as well, where like,
yeah,
like the spreading of the arms, like the touching lepers, that sort of thing.
yeah,
And so there's a direct link there between essentially like perception, or like pursuing the truth or awareness as like an inherently both aesthetic and ethical act.
for
It's
sure.
it's it's self-extension.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I appreciate that. Um, okay. I mean, we're gonna still talk about the same thing, but we're gonna shift a little bit. So I'm curious, you know, when I was working on uh, a book project a few years ago that you know about what I was calling natural creative
Mhm.
intelligence, and I was really digging into a lot of these themes, and I wanted to kind of look at, the evolution of our sensory apparatuses. I was trying to figure out which ones came earlier than others, and what were the causes and conditions that
Hmm.
led to the development of our sense of touch and taste and smell and all this, and I was trying to look at kind of the fundamental development of aesthetic experience, and then that led me to, I wanted to kind of do that as a groundwork to look at how our ethical sensibilities start to come out of that aesthetic experience.
Hmm.
And Um, so with that in mind, I'm curious what you have to say about on a macro level, like natural development and human evolution. Um, of course, we can't delineate super clearly, but just poetically, do you think that truth, beauty, or goodness kind of which one comes first, second, and third, if as well as on a more micro level, like for each individual, whether in their kind of maturity from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, or even even more micro, like in the present moment. Sorry if this is getting too complicated.
No,
In the
I got it.
present moment, which one kind of seems to be first, second, third, if there is such a thing.
Hmm. I think at this point we should really kind of try to define terms. Um,
Yes.
so just not to kind of just ping pong the multi-part question back at you.
Yeah.
Uh, functionally, for the purpose of this conversation, like how are we defining truth, goodness, beauty? Or if you want, I can just kind of like go with mm, a working definition and just take a stab at the question. But yeah, I'm just curious.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course. Yeah, I think I need to do that more. Lay down define things at the forefront. Um, yeah, I some of my questions that I have planned a little later, I was going to dive into my
Oh,
creative definitions of each
okay.
one of those, but as a simple response to your question back at me, I mean, yeah, I think beauty is grounded in aesthetic experience, sensory experience,
Hmm.
which on a really fundamental level kind of relates to what we're repulsed by and attracted to,
Hmm.
attraction and repulsion for all sorts of earthly creatures, right?
Hmm.
There's attraction and repulsion, and pleasure and suffering, of course, are intertwined with that. And I think that so our my sense is that beauty is on the most fundamental level is related to things like that. Value judgments based on sensory experience or something like that.
Hmm.
Um, and goodness, I feel like is tied up with, our ethical sensibilities and what we think is better or worse behavior toward uh, the other, you
Hmm.
know? Um, and truth, I'll kind of go into it more a little later, but
That's fine. Yeah, yeah. I think yeah.
yeah, discernment, truth is I feel like is about discernment
Hmm.
and trying to, trying to see one side is trying to see things as accurately as possible,
Hmm.
and the other side is kind of the pragmatic thing. It's like which of the we're always selecting things to pay attention to. So out of the things that we're selecting to pay attention to, which ones actually have the most um, embodied impact or something like that.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so that aligns a little bit with kind of where I was going to go with it. So given that framework, um, I think beauty comes first.
Me too.
Or kind of working backwards, right? I think um, truth and the good, as you've defined it, so like essentially like sort of accuracy and ethics or something like that.
Hmm.
They're kind of tools. They are ways of accomplishing what is essentially maybe like the fundamental drive here, which is to exist and to kind of like continue to kind of survive and thrive. And so,
Hmm.
um, you know, you were talking about like the growth of like perceptive faculties, and maybe
Yeah.
think of all of that is driven. And if we're just talking like in a purely sort of physical or biological way, uh, uh, for the purposes of like self-propagation or just propagation, just like
Hmm.
lifing, naturing, right? And so, or if you think about like an individual, right? Like just kind of again surviving, then goodness, or just you immediately, I would imagine, kind of like if I'm like a a paramecium or something, I would just sort of say, okay, well, like light source good, light source bad, um, and over time I would develop little organelles to take in data, like a on-off switch, like okay, go
Yeah.
towards this light source, go, whatever. It's like if I'm like designing a robot or something like that. Uh, And so there you have like a kind of proto discernment and you have a proto ethical valuation. Um,
Hmm.
you know, um, and the rest of it is kind of just orders of magnitude of complexity to me. So, but truth as a sort of like a standalone value is not necessarily essential to like the survival of a species.
Yeah.
Uh, you can be like basically schizophrenic, and if you're having your needs met, or if you're like, for example, if you're like in a totalitarian society, then
Hmm.
truth doesn't really matter in that way. It's really just more about kind of going along to get along because you need to survive.
Yeah.
So taking extreme examples like that, you can kind of see, what's subordinate to the other ones, and the kind of the functional quality of them. And then similarly with the good, to me, it's related to beauty for sure, because they both, I think, are kind of essentially value-laden. Kind of likes and dislikes, affinities and sort of, repulsions, like you said. But that, like, ethics, let's say like the active or sort of social component of it is how do I'm being a bit deliberately crass here, but it's sort of like how do I get what I want given the ecological or social field or milieu that I've embedded in. And I know that also like the root word of ethics kind of relates to a sense of like habituation. So it's almost like you know, beauty is some sort of aesthesis, some fundamental just like what the experience of what it is to be alive, to be anything. And that will kind of like preload you with certain conditions. You develop perceptual qualities. Ethics is just sort of like, okay, well, like in this given habitat, what are some virtues or some sort of like some habits or some processes that I can enact or reenact to be more or less okay? And then
Hmm.
truth, like faculties of discernment or just like additional perceptual uh, organs, um, are useful insofar as they help to more efficiently or more clearly um, achieve the fundamental aim. Um,
Right.
that's a stab at it. I think, and just to kind of cap this, like, um, sometimes I was thinking about this beforehand and thinking again, thinking like almost like a via negativa approach, where like, if we're thinking about truth, beauty, and goodness, okay, well, like, what if there was no truth? What if there was no beauty? What if there was no goodness? Like, what would that look like? And it very quickly just felt like this like sort of Nietzschean just swirl of pure power. It's just like it's just power and affect, and it doesn't matter essentially, whether what you're doing is good or not, whether what you're doing is ugly or not, whether what you're doing is true or not. It's just about what are the effects. Um, so it's like it's almost like hyper pragmatic in that way. And I think even then, even with that sort of like intensely groundless ground, um, what you're left with is still aesthesis. It's still feeling because that's just what
Yeah.
it is to be anything. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah. 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 I kind of beauty, goodness, and truth. That's the trajectory that I see as well. And that's interesting what you're saying about truth and how, you know, if we're thinking about like surviving and thriving, then the truth isn't always as central as beauty and goodness. You know what I mean? Like in certain contexts, the truth, unfortunately, I think,
Yeah, it is a
is
problem. Yeah,
not.
yeah, yeah.
It's a problem. And so
Yeah.
It's not always valued in the same way that beauty and goodness are, perhaps. Um, yeah, and we'll dig into that more as we go. But
Hmm.
I've shared with you. So when I was living in South Georgia with my parents, right, for 4 months when I moved back from Columbia, I had a lot of time because I was in rural South Georgia in the middle of nowhere, and I was just spending all my time with my parents and
Yeah.
working from home, and it was very slow, but it was great, and I think about that. I think about those months frequently, and I kind of miss it. There was something very slow and sweet and simple about that time, and it was nice. And so, in the midst of having all that time and space, I spent a lot of time just kind of reflecting on my my perspective on some of these philosophical topics, right? And so, and I spent a lot of time thinking about truth, beauty, and goodness. And since I am who I am, and you know that I use kind of divination for certain things like this, right? So
Hmm.
I would use book divination to kind of give me some interesting things to consider, and kind of as a creative way to um, treat, close my eyes, open up a certain book after having a question. So, for example, I'd say, "What what else can I consider about beauty?" or something like that, right?
Hmm.
Open up to a random page and select a sentence or a passage that and act as if that were giving me some sort of response to my question, right? And so when I did that for beauty, I turned to a Simone Weil quote, and unfortunately, I couldn't find it today, but that's okay because I feel like kind of what the stuff that it brought up for me is what's kind of the most meaningful as I carry it forward. But
Yeah.
so in that divination, basically, I had started to map out this my vision of beauty, and I had it's kind of this three prong vision of beauty, right?
Hmm.
And the first prong is um, a resonance or even maybe a harmony. This it kind of sounds very like Whiteheadian, right? But like a resonance or a harmony and intensity um, between multiple parts,
Hmm.
right? So in the midst of plurality, resonance and some sort of intensity and harmony is one way to look at beauty. And you could think about that in nature, of course. You could think about that in a work of art or a film or
Hmm.
music. There's this plurality and there's a resonance among the parts of that plurality. So that's prong one. And I'll just go through these three and then we can talk about
Yeah.
it. I'd love
Yeah.
to
Let's
hear
do.
what you have to say about any of
Yeah.
these. So that's the first prong. Um, the second prong is this very uh, kind of raw and unique expression of the individual or one of the parts, right? And so, for me, I love intimate art, poetry that feels intimate in some way, films that feel intimate, music that feels intimate. And related to that intimacy, I love a certain raw expression. Sometimes that's in the form of like almost diaristic, like nonfiction kind of vulnerability,
Hmm.
where a writer or an artist is like bearing their soul or something, and
Hmm.
that unique expression of the individual brings me to tears, and I feel like it's beautiful.
Yeah.
It feels very beautiful. So that's the second prong, and then I don't know if I want to say that this is a prong in itself. At this point, I'll just say that hovering in between those two together cultivate beauty as well, right? Like the raw expression of the part or individual in the midst of being part of this plurality or collective. Um, the relationship between the raw expression of the individual, the unique expression of the individual, and the resonance among the parts.
Hmm.
It's kind of the in between between number one and two, right? But the third and last one is something like more kind of the sublime or the ineffable,
Hmm.
finding beauty in that which can't quite be articulated, um, looking out at a beautiful landscape and your brain can't really take it all in at once. And there's something, it's like awe, it's related to awe as we talked about. Um, and even certain kinds of art make me feel that way. And
Hmm.
uh, the example, the experience that popped up when I was thinking about this in South Georgia was these big wind chimes that my mom had outside, and there was something about this sublime quality of the wind that would move through these wind chimes and just create these beautiful sounds, and it felt almost like ineffable beauty somehow.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, I wonder what you think about that kind of perspective of beauty.
Yeah. Um, well, I think I'm gonna approach this with like a little bit of a riff on your framework. Um,
Sure.
and hopefully that riff doesn't like constitute a violation of your framework. And if it does, then
No, that's
we can
fine.
talk about it. Uh, but as I was sort of like organizing it in my head, um, I kind of saw them almost like on a continuum. And I do think that fitness or resonance or the perception basically of a kind of fitness or resonance or harmony. And again, we can bring in music as I'm apt to do and want to do.
Hmm.
I think
Please
it's
do.
gonna be useful here. But I think that first fork, kind of like harmony between parts, is actually kind of the middle of this continuum, maybe. The ineffable, or like the relationship or the perception of the ineffable, is kind of like the extreme on one end. And expression, or like raw expression, is kind of the extreme on the other end. And if you think about it
Mm,
numerically, let's say like sort of like the raw expression, raw experience is kind of like a first degree or like 1 degree of freedom
number one.
sense of harmony or resonance. It's like a single melody line and the purity of a single melody line. That it can go any which way it wants. It's just pure feeling, unadorned, and it's monophonic music, right? Then, if you think about like for example, in Western music, like the kind of the development of it, it goes to, like I mentioned plainsong before. I was probably because of like medieval music is just on the brain, but like, um, y- uh, eventually you get kind of like, uh, um like a drone, some sort of ostinato underneath that creates it's like a fourth or a fifth that creates, some non-trivial harmony. And then the drone starts to shift almost like a shifting bass line. And then you add like voices, and then all of a sudden you have like this like polyphony where, four voices are doing different things. And then, like you just add dissonances and dissonances and dissonances until you get to something that sounds quite alien and risky. And I think that's what the ineffable is. It's just like a sort of like an
Mm,
infinite, it's the infinity of voices. So, um, so hopefully that kind of like that metaphor stayed uh, coherent and not didn't just sort of fly
yeah.
off into space. But like, um, that all of its beauty. The beauty is sort of like the relationship, the experience and the perceptual quality of like whether this is great or not. Of like, n equals one, a single line raw experience, to n equals some integer, which is the harmony between like you think of like sort of like stacking voices or like a an orchestration or like a chord, um, all the way to just what is the feeling of beauty, um when you're perceiving like an essentially like an infinite amount of voices, or like the voice of God, so to speak, or the
Hmm.
universe. What if you were able to feel every single pulse of everything in the universe through time immemorial in one moment. Like what's the feeling of that? It's almost like an ultimate ineffability. And also like ineffability,
Hmm.
the word is like that which cannot be spoken, either spoken or spoken about.
Yep. Yep.
Um, and so it's like if you were to try to fit every word in the Oxford English Dictionary, um, and try to say that at one time, like that's what we're talking about when we talk about the ineffable.
Yeah.
And so yeah, just like on like a number chart, I feel like it's all kind of talking about the perception of a kind of music, a melody or a resonance or a harmony, but like from one to n equals infinity. Does that make sense?
No, that's great. That's cool. Yeah. As you were speaking, I was like, well, um, maybe the ineffable is zero, perhaps, and
It's both. Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Yeah.
zero infinity at the same time,
Yeah.
and the raw expression of the individual is one, and then once you get into two and three and
That's right.
beyond, it's the dynamic relationship between the parts.
Yeah. Not to name drop, but you sound like was it Alain Badiou
Oh, really?
God is the zero, more or less,
Oh, yeah,
the
yeah,
null
yeah.
set.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, before I kind of do the same sort of thing with goodness,
Okay.
I
Yeah.
wanna I want to I want to ask you, I love that you brought in music and it really makes it vivid, and I think it's just a perfect analogy for what I was saying, a
Mm.
perfect illustration or expression of what I was trying to say too. But also, if we think about like um a community or a collective or a society, right?
Yeah.
Uh, I want to dig into that a little bit, like how, because for me, I really value the unique expression of the individual, and I also value um, harmonic relationship among individuals and parts, right? And it's like, how can we strike a balance between those two without
Hmm.
losing one or the other? You know what I
Hmm.
mean? So I know this is the type of thing that you've thought about a lot. So if we kind of apply what we were just saying about music and stuff, like to human collectives, what would you have to say about that?
Um,
I know it's a big question, but yeah,
well,
we don't have to capture all of it. I just,
no, it's okay. It's okay. I just, I think it's at this point it's crucial to acknowledge that like having an intellectual understanding of or like sort of a conceptual framework for something is great and I love it and I'm going to pursue that for the rest of my life.
yeah,
And it's just so different from applying those principles in like concrete reality to your point, right?
source. Yeah, of course.
And so um I'll say this. I'll say that I think the world that I would like to live in um is not solipsistic. It's not all about one thing. It's not completely fragmented. Uh because and going back to kind of like maybe my earliest impulses, I kind of like I think I kind of want uh entities to be included. I think that's a usually a better thing.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that like a lot of our problems, again, ignorance, greed, hatred, whatever, have to do with a sort of inability to harmonize with other with dissonance.
Hmm.
And that's just like a thing, like maybe like the fundamental
Yeah.
way that we're struggling with as a species, the way that we are struggling as a species, I should say. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
uh, okay, so you see here, I am veering off into abstraction again. Concrete reality. Yeah, let's say two things. Firstly, that like the principle then is sort of like is like dynamic tension that if we um sort of neither order nor chaos. The answer is kind of somewhere in the middle.
Hmm.
Uh, and and then maybe just like having orientation strategy structures in place such that you are extending like the participatory capacity for more and more agents um all the time, and that you kind of have structures in place such that those agents can participate in a meaningful way. And I think that kind of like strikes a good balance between um coherence and suppleness. Essentially, what I'm articulating maybe is sort of like uh, a kind of crawling up the number line from before, from like one to infinity and beyond. Um, um, yeah, does that make sense? So
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
to
yeah,
maybe just kind
totally.
of ground it further. Yeah, I think what I'm really articulating is basically like democracy. Uh,
Yeah, yeah,
but but um, but it can't just be mob rule. I think actually really what I'm articulating is probably like sort of like liberal social democracy. Um, that like, you know, it's better to have more diversity than less diversity. Um, it is you know, better to have kind of like more buy-in when it comes to decision making than less. Um, But in order for people to meaningfully do those things, there needs to be some sort of system and some sort of like principles and basic resources and needs met such that they can do those things in a way that like has efficacy as opposed to just sort of like going through the motions or just sort of like having like a faux sense of participation when really it's just like a handful of
yeah.
people um,
Right.
or beings, right? Because it's not just people as well. It's we want to
Yeah,
extend that to the non-human because um, we're all here, like
yeah,
whether we want it to be or not. Here we are,
yeah,
and we
yeah,
um, a trivial solution would be to kind of like extinguish everyone else from the face of the earth and just kind of like live alone amongst inorganic material.
right.
But I just think that's I don't I don't think that's as good. Yeah.
Yeah,
That was
same,
again
same,
ranty,
same,
but
same. No,
I
no,
hope
no,
that
that's
was
good stuff.
pertinent. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. Um, yes. So I did a similar thing with goodness, right? I did a divination about goodness,
Hmm.
and when I was in South Georgia, and with these divinations, it's like, as I hope you know about me, it ends up being kind of just a playful framework, really, for me to kind of consider and expand upon. It's not like, oh yeah, now I know exactly what
Hmm.
beauty is, or now I
Yeah,
know
of course, of
exactly what
course.
goodness is. It's just
Yeah.
like, well, whoa, this is kind of a cool way to reflect on it. So with goodness, what I was led to is so, I started to think about how it's been hard for me to know what love is on like a philosophical or cosmic level, right? It's been hard for me to
Okay.
kind of create a philosophy of love in a certain way, in some ways. But I started to imagine that, you know, me and you have talked about this idea of the apeiron, um, right? This ontological surplus.
Hmm.
Uh, and so if there's kind of this boundless surplus, perhaps at the as the fundamental nature of nature or reality, right? That allows for just um, constant expression into a plurality of forms.
Hmm.
Um, And so I started thinking about love as that surplus, basically, right? Like on a cosmological level, like
Sure.
love could be seen as this constant spilling over, the spilling out that never it's unending. It's unborn and unending. Um,
Yeah.
And you could say that that's love. It's a certain type of giving. It's a certain type of generosity, you know? Um, and so there's that. And then for us as beings who, are in all of the conditions that we've been talking about during this conversation,
Hmm.
I started to imagine that goodness is the acknowledgement of that surplus, the acknowledgement that, you know, since nature is always kind of exceeding its past, there's new things that are constantly being created, right?
Hmm.
And you could say that, that's a type of transcendence. Like the
Hmm.
present is always transcending the past in that way because these new forms are always getting created.
Yeah.
And that's connected to the surplus idea, right? The surplus is what allows for these new things to always be created because
Okay.
it's not just some static loop, it's
Hmm.
always it's novelty producing.
Hmm.
So perhaps we could say that one way to think about goodness is acknowledging that surplus and kind of wielding it to not get stuck in the same loops from the past, collectively and individually. Um,
Okay.
Acknowledging it in a way that prevents us from being caught into the loop of self-absorption, where we're like it's always spilling beyond us as individuals.
Hmm.
Um, and I haven't quite articulated it very well, but I think that hopefully you get what I'm saying. Um, I know that acknowledging the surplus doesn't automatically have like an ethical framework attached to it, right? But
Hmm.
I would imagine that goodness is trying to ethically wield the surplus, you could say, if that makes sense, right? Goodness is the acknowledgement and the ethical wielding of the surplus. I know
Okay.
it sounds abstract, but what do you have to say about that?
I guess what I'm maybe struggling with or
Hmm.
or sort of um instinctually pushing back against is that that's still
Hmm.
it seems like a kind of like just it's a functional kind of like I hesitate to say the word arbitrary because I don't mean that in the pejorative sense. I mean like in like the literal sense of like that's a choice. To kind of define goodness in that way. And I think that's
Oh,
kind of
sure.
like I'm that's sort of running up against my struggles with that sort of thing where like uh what makes that a better or how are we gonna how do we make non like tautological judgments about that statement? Do you know what I mean? So unless we're both sort of like a kind of acknowledging the fact or acknowledging the idea, let's say not the fact, but like the idea that ethical perspectives or frameworks or kind of like foundations are exactly that. They're just sort of like ways of standing within the flux, right? So
Hmm.
kind of going kind of uh stepping back with you to like the Apeiron, like the boundless, right? Like th there's there's an ineffable like plurality, infinitude of perspectives, right? And to me, ethics, they are contingent, um, depending on because your aims and your circumstances are both going to be radically different, just depending on where you are at, right? So you can have like consensus ethics, you can have like given the fact that you're always dealing with the human species and we live on a planet that has such and such conditions, right? Like generally speaking, certain things are going to be better versus not, right? Sure.
Hmm.
Um, that's also like if you zoom out, right, it becomes like this very sort of like local. set of constraints and circumstances, and sort of like, so ethics is a design problem is what I'm trying to say, right? So
Yeah.
so I guess maybe I struggle to see um how goodness becomes transcendental without kind of collapsing back on a sense of willfulness or a sense of choice. Um, and that's not to say that it's meaningless, but
Mm,
that just like I think we need to kind of reconstitute its grounding. Does that make
I
sense?
got you. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, I guess one thing I want to say just to maybe ground it a little bit more, maybe give like a more concrete example of what I'm trying to get at
Hmm.
is, okay, so if we think about an individual first, an
Hmm.
individual who might have certain patterns and loops of, letting anger lead them to a lot of unnecessary suffering, right? They
Hmm.
might get caught up in loops of anger that make them treat others like shit or treat themselves like shit or whatever, right? Um,
Oh,
and
I see. Yeah.
uh, so and that could be all sorts of different patterns that an individual can have that
Yeah.
it's like this karmic momentum, that this inertia almost, it just kind of that's the loops that they find themselves in. But if they can acknowledge that they it might be very difficult, it is very difficult, but it's possible, I believe, to not just be completely subject to those static loops anymore. And that's a
Right.
type of surplus that they can acknowledge within themselves that allows them to kind of transcend those loops in the
Right.
same way that a family or a community, a community or a society that has had certain loops that have a lot of karmic momentum, but by realizing that it doesn't necessarily have to stay that way, there's a
Hmm.
certain type of surplus or a certain type of freedom and adapt flexibility and creativity that can allow us to not just stay in those loops in a static way. To me, that is a cool way to think about goodness in my in
Sure.
my mind. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I get what you're saying. So maybe this is the other part of what I was butting up against because I think I agree with a lot of that. Um, I suppose that um, wielding, like the term wielding, is maybe doing the most
Yeah.
work in this definition then, because I think it goes back to discernment. I don't think that wielding the surplus just um, towards breaking loops or breaking conditioning
Hmm.
is all of it. And I mean, and
Hmm. Hmm.
kind of like confirm my understanding of what you're saying than it is to kind of like respond to it. But that you know, uh, if we're just gonna make it unidirectional, then like the extreme of that is a kind of just falling into chaos. It's the pure anarchy of surplus, which has its own sort of challenges, evils, etc.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
It's a good point.
sometimes staying in the loop, sometimes establishing a loop,
Hmm.
establishing solidity and order, and a conditioning, such that it becomes a system that can aid in the accomplishing of something is the appropriate
Yes.
response.
Yes.
Sometimes going backwards and saying like, "Oh, hey, we've gone too far.
Hmm.
Let's kind of point in the other direction and simplify." Maybe that's the appropriate response. And so like
Hmm.
wielding the surplus and acknowledging that the surplus is omnidirectional. That to your point before about like zero is
Yeah.
just as infinite as infinity, which sounds like the most abstract bullshit. Like, but I think, I think it's kind of doing some conceptual work here that like, you know, micro macro like infinity is in every direction, and and as such, it doesn't imply an ought. And so I think in all of this, if we're going to establish any kind of goodness, it's going to be in the work of wielding and discernment and making choices,
Yeah.
none of which have an answer, But in the local accomplishing of some sort of goal, I think that's like the best that we can kind of um, make sense of, right?
Yeah,
Because
no,
so
those are great points.
yeah, just to cap it, because it's like, even if you are, wielding the surplus in a way that makes perfect sense to you in that moment, like, you know, the surplus also implies emergence. Like novelty is still going to be,
Hmm.
exercising itself, and like so there's a certain degree of like, at least from our perspective, like indeterminacy. We
Yeah.
haven't, we haven't grown technology to the point where we like have like invented Laplace's demon. Like it's not, even if we like intellectually assent to like a deterministic universe, we still haven't been able to like make the calculator.
Hmm.
So it's just, who who's to say that, I guess it's like the Chinese farmer parable again, right? Who's to say that like a good action in this frame of time is going to stay a good action
Yeah.
um in the long run? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate all that. And that, it's that model of goodness that I was saying, it needs to be refined and fleshed out. And this dialogue is helping me think about that. So it's like, um, if I the shadow side of just embracing the surplus or embracing flux can lead to kind of just pure chaos, like you said.
Hmm.
And so part of goodness is not only wielding the surplus, but it's after doing that and after kind of being able to widen ourselves so that we're not just stuck in loops that cause unnecessary suffering. It's about going from there and then developing loops or conditioning or systems um, that are more nurturing or don't have some of the traps of the previous system or whatever, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I think nurturing is a really great word for it, because I think nurturing, it relates to life, and it kind of captures like the both-handedness of this. That it's, nurturing is, you want something, you want a child to grow, you want an entity to kind of prosper. And so it's going to change. It's going to be dynamic. It's going to kind of overcome itself. And at the same time, nurturing implies a sense of like, okay, well, in order for you to grow, you need solidity, you need an environment and
Yeah,
structure and system,
totally.
and protection, in order to kind of facilitate that. Um, uh, yeah,
Boundaries.
yeah, boundaries, and that's kind of like, it's just, that's how life works. It works through both overcoming and adaptation and homeostasis. Um,
Yep.
yeah, it's the, it's again kind of zero, infinity, chaos, order, blah blah blah.
Hmm.
It's
Hmm.
a the answer's a balance most of the
No
time.
doubt.
Yeah.
No doubt. Yeah. It's good stuff. Um, when I did the same thing for truth down in South Georgia,
Gosh,
this
I should have seen that coming.
yeah, when I did the same thing for truth down in South Georgia, I turned to a page of a book. I don't even remember what book it was, but the title of the chapter was The Way of Ignorance. And
Hmm.
right underneath the title of that chapter, there was a quote from T.S. Eliot to
Hmm.
introduce the chapter. It wasn't a T.S. Eliot book, but there was this quote from T.S. Eliot that said, in order to arrive at what you do not know, you must go by a way which is the way of ignorance.
Hmm.
And of course, that reminded me of things like beginner's mind,
Sure.
right? Intellectual humility. And those two things, the beginner's mind, intellectual humility, are very important to me. And to think about that as kind of the foundation for um, our perception of truth, our
Hmm.
encounter with truth, um, I think that that is a really cool starting point.
Hmm.
Um, So, yeah, I guess first off, yeah, how important do you think it is to kind of go through the way of ignorance to encounter the truth, so to speak, or the beginner's mind or intellectual humility?
Yeah. Um, hmm. I think I'm just gonna kind of shotgun this and then
Mm-hmm.
hopefully uh recapitulate with more coherence at the end.
Sure. Sure.
Um, when I think about ignorance, I mean, I think just like etymologically, like ignosis, right? Like it's just like it is just unknowing.
Hmm.
Um, which obviously then if you think about like ignorance as we established before, right? Like it has positive and negative aspects, qualities to it, to me. Um, I do think that unknowing kind of it reminds me of what you were saying before about like wielding the surplus and novelty that like kind of
Hmm.
it's a cracking open, it's a keeping supple, liquefying essentially the solidity of potential dogmatic structures, thought loops, etc.
Hmm.
But that, you know, I think one and it's sort of like part of the current crisis that we're in is one of sort of like permanent liquidity or like hyper liquidity
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that it's like yeah, unknowing deconstruction, they're great. Uh if that's all we're left with, then that will be it goes back to what I was saying before, where like if you know if truth doesn't exist, then it's pure power and affect. And I think we're seeing a lot of that.
Hmm.
So you know, it's like kind of tempering. Yes, I do think that unknowing and ignorance in the sense of like kind of critique is fundamentally important. Beginner's mind important.
Hmm.
Testing, verification. That's kind of when I think about the pursuit of truth, you know, I think of um, that ability to kind of test and you know and verify and experience and be open to new
Hmm.
experiences for sure. And it goes back to self-expansion as a kind of like part of how truth works, how coming to be aware of anything works, learning, carving new trails. And at the same time, uh, I think that like, uh, I mean, this is me sounding like a broken record at this point, but like truth, um, also requires, I think, a sense of like, society, of kind of like, hey, are you seeing this too? Consensus. It requires institutions. You know, most of the time, like, I am not, I don't think anyone is like purely relying upon direct experiences to like, even like the most radically empirical person is not relying on
Hmm.
direct experience to know truth.
Hmm.
The moment you open up a book, or like
Yeah.
read the news, you know, you're not like all that we know, all that I as a layman knows about human anatomy was not gained through like prying open corpses.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, my knowledge of like, you know, the words of Plato, you know, I'm not gonna say the words of Socrates because that's totally suspect, but like you know that's like it's translation and so like there's already
Hmm.
the necessity for like certain again structure systems order in
Hmm.
order to acquire anything resembling truth as like I think we kind of understand it colloquially and so yes ignorance the deconstructive component the openness great also, ignorance, if you're talking about just completely destroying any sense of like objectivity to the point where it could be co-opted by demagogues and, you know, just power,
Hmm.
um, then you've gone too far down a hole that you become self-defeating and honestly kind of like incoherent. That's like
Yeah.
that's just not how you live your life.
Hmm.
And so I think, you know, cultivating institution and a sense of like structure that this is the way that we procedurally come to know anything is also important. Yeah. So I think
Absolutely.
maybe the recapitulation is just sort of like the scientific method, maybe. You know,
Yeah.
I don't want to be like, you know, I don't want to sound like Daniel Dennett or something, but because I hate that guy. But you know, I think that that striking that balance between kind of openness, but also there's a certain method, um, is feels necessary to me towards how I understand the process of truth making to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm glad this is great because it's like there's always a bothness, you know. Related to what you're saying, another way I was thinking about truth or I have for a few years is like truth as kind of an alchemical process. And what I mean by that is like on the direct experience level, and I think you made some great points about how so much of our assessment of truth is not from direct experience, but it's like it requires systems to be in place where we're kind of getting our sense of truth by, through other people and whatnot.
Yeah, and social systems
Um,
specifically, yeah.
what now? Oh yeah,
So
so yeah,
social
exactly.
systems, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um, on on the, seeing truth as an alchemical process, what I mean is like there's the raw material of direct experience, just on that side of things. Um, and let's say there's the raw experience, the raw material with there's the raw material of an interpersonal relationship, for example, right?
Hmm.
The interpersonal relationship that you have with another person is a sort of raw material, a sort of direct experience.
Hmm.
And through that raw material, you start to gain certain insights. You start to develop a sense of certain things that seem true or false. Um, and then you come to this insight about what is true, even if it's just what is true in the context of your relationship with that other person, certain just basic things like I react this way when this happens, and they seem to react this way when this other thing happens. And when we're in, like, yeah, you start to kind of gain information about your
Hmm.
relationship with that other person. And it's a certain kind of discovery of truth in a way, through the raw material, through the direct experience of that. And then you start to develop insights, you start to develop a sense of truth, and then it becomes alchemical because kind of what you're saying about the scientific method or testing, um, you start to test your notion of truth, or you start to test that specific insight up against the continued direct experience with that other
Hmm.
person, for example, just using that example. This could apply to so many
Yeah,
different
yeah,
things.
yeah, for sure.
So you start to kind of test that insight or your sense of truth through your ongoing direct experience, and it becomes alchemical in that way because you're using the raw material that ends up kind of transforming into something that is more and more embodied and lived and I guess precise through the actual lived experience
Hmm.
with that other person in the case of an interpersonal relationship. So I like to see truth as alive in that way. It's not like a static thing. It's always being, as far as our engagement with the truth, it's always being, applied and assessed through our actual experience, or I think it should be.
Hmm. Yes, and uh
Yeah, love it.
so I was thinking about this earlier as well, like before just sort of, kind of like just mentally preparing for the
Hmm.
discussion.
Hmm.
Um, and thinking about, treating the question a different way,
Hmm.
like not like what is truth or not what if truth didn't exist, but something like
Hmm.
um you know, I suppose this is a sort of rationalist way, like if so much of what we make of truth is alive and dynamic and interpersonal,
Hmm.
interrelational, uh, kind of like depends on a bit of faith, really, in the sense of like trustworthiness, right?
Hmm.
Like just like, okay, is my experience of the other person, is my experience of the world, is my experience of myself, is any of this sort of like accurate? Because
Hmm.
even if it's habitual, even if it's repetitive, doesn't necessarily guarantee that it's going to stay that way. Again, if we're going to be
Sure.
like radically empirical about it, but you know, I was compelled into like the direction of something like like mathematics or whatever, where like that seemingly the what you're left with beyond like again sort of contingency and flux and any sort of like anything that depends upon sort of like verification or
Mm-hmm.
trustworthiness or like any sort of interrelation, is just for like the structure of like logic or just you arithmetic or something like that. That regardless of your reference frame, it's going to be that relationship will hold. Um, uh, so maybe to kind of like cap this, it's almost like there is a organic truth and an inorganic truth in the same way that there's like organic and inorganic material. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that like inorganic truth is something like a logic that is kind of cold and dead. Uh, but if we're looking for like any sort of like stability, like there you go. Um, or almost like sort of like the decayed like nucleus of something. Like the core that's what it is in this like unadorned way, but you're not going to be able to relate to it at all.
Right.
And then you have like kind of like around that like the mantle like the you know these like the flares and like all this sort of like living molten activity on top of that cold truth, like almost like a
Mm.
as like a generative effluence from those like numerical relationships of like okay,
Yeah.
um and that uh that's the interesting stuff that's like more perspectival. um yeah, so like inorganic organic, I almost also see it as sort of like kind of like
Okay.
tracing back like the like it gets into cosmology a little bit because um you know uh kind of one equals one or like the singularity is a very incontrovertible truth. And like it's sort of like it, if we're talking about like a universal truth, it's like yeah, the universe is like as universal as you can get, which sounds so stupid now that I say that out loud, but here we are.
No, I hear
um
you.
but like once that sort of like things itself into like a diversity of locations, and
Yeah.
loci, right? It's like a location, locus implies a kind of like relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Then you get like different sort of like windows on the world, and then you get to like this sort of dynamic shifting truth because what's happening at the local level is a sense of filtered experience and seeing through a glass darkly, and that like there's only so much light that will reach you in your lifetime. There's only so much information that will reach you in your lifetime,
Mm-hmm.
um, about yourself or the person or the star next to you, much less like the other end of the galaxy.
Yeah.
Um, and so yeah, so again, I think truth is sort of like bivalent in that way. There's inorganic, dead, sort of like simplistic cosmological truth, numerical truth, and
Mm-hmm.
then there's truth in the maybe like the multiplicator, like lower T sense, which is more dynamic, pragmatic, alive, relevant to our experience. Um, yeah, and
Yeah, and even
does that make
even
sense?
the inorganic, yeah, sure, that's cool. Even the inorganic truths can be dynamically applied to
Exactly.
kind of the micro too, so that's it's fun.
Yeah,
Um, well, I have two more questions. I know that we're almost at an hour and a half, so I have two more questions. Riff on them as long or as short as you want. Related to kind of universality that you said, this quote from Kant has always stood out to me in the context of ethics, and I'm wondering what you
context.
have to say about it. So he said he wrote,
Good.
act only according to the maxim which you can will, okay, which you can will to become a universal law.
Sure.
Um, what do you think about that?
Um, Man, fuck the categorical imperative. Uh, uh, why?
Mm,
Um, and also like, is that actionable? You know,
mm-hmm,
circumstances change,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
and I think, a person living in squalor who is like eking out an existence, um, you wouldn't expect them to uh, operate from the same principles that someone who's like living in the lap of
Mm-hmm.
luxury would. Um,
Mm-hmm.
or at least, even if you have the same principles, they would express themselves in radically different ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, I think it's very easy for someone like Kant uh, um, to kind of like arrive at that conclusion from the comforts of his home uh,
Yeah.
versus, like I don't know if you're like you don't know where your next meal is going to come from and your house used to be a house and is now like a pile of rubble and
Mm-hmm.
like it's nonsense.
I hear
Yeah, I don't know, I have a visceral reaction to kind of like
you.
a deontological ethics. I just
Yeah.
don't think it's useful or realistic. Okay, to be charitable, I think maybe what they're trying to reach for is it reminds me of like Keats, right? Because when I was looking at the question, that's kind of like the first place my mind went was, end of
Mm-hmm.
Grecian Urn, where he's talking about like, truth is beauty, beauty is truth, blah blah blah. And like Keats being a young, soon to be dead person, uh, he was like, that poem to me is all about just looking for anything eternal, anything that's like will last, anything, some sort of ground, God, you know, uh, the Greeks, just something that we can say, all right, this is solid. No matter what else goes on, this is
Mm-hmm.
solid because like, you want
Mm-hmm.
something to base your society around. But we're not gonna I don't think that we're gonna find that. That's a cop out. And the work of socializing and living, to your point before, is like it's highly dynamic and kind of aleatoric and indeterminate. And so yeah, I think looking for universal maxims is just it's too cushy for me.
The last thing, and after I asked this question, if there's anything that you had kind of thought of beforehand that we didn't touch on if you wanted to, but um, something we've talked about before and something that we both, I think, care about is kind of like understanding living systems. And I get really excited about the idea of kind of modeling different, you know, human systems off of living systems.
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering, is there anything that we haven't touched on maybe that ways that we could model model our human systems off of living systems that would kind of honor uh, beauty, truth, and goodness, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Gosh, I think we kind of touched on it a little bit with the paramecium kind of example when we were talking about kind of like what comes first, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Um, that maybe there's a sort of recognition um that we're kind of like in a swirl of like affinities and repulsions, that we're just as much a part of that as everything else. Um,
Yeah.
and so to kind of like understand these concepts, I think to me it's useful to look at just like how life works as a whole, or just like even going beyond living systems to uh just physics. Although I'm like correcting myself that like, okay, well, like living systems involve the inorganic and the whole thing is kind of
Hmm.
like alive in this panpsychist way to some degree. Like that's a whole other can of worms, uh but yeah, just kind of it's fun or helpful to me to think about, the ways in which um our biological histories still drive and inform uh these abstracted and kind of like
Hmm.
potentially lofty concepts. So,
Hmm.
because I'll close by saying that, like, because I think that that part of the problem of like hyperliquidity and modernity and so on is that we've experienced a kind of loss of ground, and that's, unless you are just like going to be an ostrich and stick your head in the sand, it's like it needs to be reckoned with. And and it uh sort of to be clear-eyed to kind of our kind of molten existence, and
Yeah,
our history, and how biological and how physical and how ecological it is, like how material it is, really. Like I think it's like a return to kind of like visceral, corporeal existence and animal existence. Um, and to acknowledge that is going to be important for any sort of like development of the conception of truth, beauty, and goodness that we could come up with in the future,
sure.
versus just sort of like falling back on, okay, well, you know, it's this like unchanging sun floating out in the firmament,
Right.
that's going to kind of like in a top-down way deter like sort of um,
Hmm.
dictate what those things are. Like that's not going to happen, and so we need to kind of like dig into the ground instead, into the dirt. I know that was sort of like waxing poetic a little bit, but I hope that
No,
kind
that's
of came
great.
through. Yeah, that like living systems, I think sort of recognizing that we are also alive in that animal
Yes.
corporeal way, and having that
Yep.
inform our conceptions of these things is going to be crucial to whether or not we survive.